The jungle took her before anyone noticed she was gone. That was the part that stayed with the men who were there. Not the ambush, not the firefight that lit up 300 meters of trail in under 4 minutes. What stayed with them was the silence after. The count-off over comms, the names called in sequence, and the pause where her name should have been. And then the order to move. They moved. Her name was Sergeant First Class Elaine Doss. She was 31 years old, had qualified expert on every weapons platform the Army had put in front of her since she was 19, and had spent the better part of a decade doing work that most people in her unit couldn't have described, even if they'd been asked directly. She wasn't loud about any of it. That was the thing about Doss that the people who knew her always mentioned first, and always last. She wasn't loud about it. The mission had been a reconnaissance insertion into the Darien Corridor, a stretch of jungle along the Colombia-Panama border that had been moving weapons north in shipments that got larger every 6 months and quieter every 6 months after that. The team's objective was to confirm a forward staging area, document what was there, and extract before first light. 8 people in, 8 people out, 72 hours. They were 17 hours in when the trail became a kill zone. The ambush was professional. That was the word Lieutenant Colonel Marin used in the debrief 3 days later, which is worth noting, because Marin wasn't a man who gave credit to enemies without cause. Professionally executed. Overlapping fields of fire. Initiated at the front and the rear simultaneously, which meant whoever was running the southern end of that network had people who'd been trained somewhere real. The team broke contact the way they trained to peel left, consolidate at the secondary rally point 200 meters west. It worked. 6 of them made it to the rally point in 4 minutes. 2 didn't. One of the 2 who didn't was Private First Class Ortega, who took a round in the lower leg at the initiation point and went down in the first 30 seconds. The medic, Specialist Theus, peeled back for him and got them both moving. The other was Doss. What happened to Doss was this. She was at the rear of the formation when the ambush initiated from the front, which meant she was the first to engage the trigger element that had positioned itself behind them to cut off retreat. She suppressed it, burned through 1 full magazine, keeping heads down while the team in front of her got moving, went to transition to her secondary, and then the ground disappeared. The trail ran along a ridgeline. On the left side, jungle floor, maybe 6 feet down, navigable. On the right side, a 30-foot drop into a dry creek bed. The running, the recoil, the loose soil. She went right. She hit the bottom of that creek bed and felt her left ankle give in a way that left no room for interpretation. She lay still for 11 seconds. She counted them, listening for movement above. There was none. The team was already gone. She could hear the firefight pulling west, which meant they were peeling correctly, which meant the rally point was 200 meters that direction, and she was at the bottom of a 30-foot drop with a broken ankle and no way to call out without giving her position to whatever was still moving on that trail. She made a decision. It wasn't a complicated decision, in the way that decisions made under fire rarely are. There was one direction that led toward the objective and one direction that didn't. She picked the one that did. Doss had been attached to this team for 11 months. She'd been requested by name by the team sergeant, a man named Whitaker, who had worked with her on a previous rotation and had put it in writing that she was the best field intelligence collector he'd ever seen work, and that her marksmanship alone was worth 2 additional personnel. His request had gone up through the chain of command, had been approved, and had then spent 3 weeks sitting on a desk while 2 separate officers tried to find a regulatory reason to deny it on grounds that had nothing to do with regulation. She found out about this later. She found out because one of those officers, a major named Colton, had CC'd the wrong person on an email that used the phrase optics of the situation in a way that had nothing to do with optical sights. Whitaker had shown it to her. She'd read it once. She hadn't said anything about it. Whitaker, who had expected something, had waited for a response. "When do we leave?" she said. That had been 11 months ago. In those 11 months, she had been part of 4 operations, had produced intelligence assessments that were quoted in 2 separate command briefings, and had twice placed accurate fire on targets at distances that the after-action reports described with numbers that other people on the team had quietly looked up later to verify were possible. She was not an officer. She had been passed over for promotion to Sergeant First Class once, in a cycle where 2 men with fewer deployments and lower evaluation scores had been selected above her. The board notes were not available to her. They never were. None of this was on her mind at the bottom of the creek bed. What was on her mind was her ankle, her ammunition count, the distance to the objective, and the position of the sun, which was already moving and would not wait for her. She used her knife and 2 sections of branch she cut from a piece of deadfall to make something that wasn't quite a splint and wasn't quite not one. It would hold, it would hurt. Both of those things were true, and she accepted both of them in about 90 seconds of work, which was all she could afford. She took stock: 1 rifle, 4 magazines remaining, plus the 1 seated, 1 sidearm, 2 fragmentation grenades, 1 smoke, the rest of her kit. Her radio had taken something in the fall. The handset was cracked, and the transmit function was producing nothing but static when she keyed it. She could receive, broken and intermittent, but she couldn't send. She pulled up what she had in her head about the objective: a compound, identified by signals intelligence and aerial imagery, approximately 4 kilometers northeast of the ambush site. She had studied the imagery. She knew the layout in the way that she knew most things, which was thoroughly and without making a production of it. 4 kilometers. 1. Ankle. No comms. She started moving. The creek bed ran northeast for about a kilometer before it bent east and became unusable. She used that kilometer. Every step on the left foot was a renegotiation she had to have with herself, and she had it quietly, in the same tone she used for everything. She moved at about half her normal pace. She calculated what that meant for her timeline. She adjusted. At the bend in the creek, she came up out of the bed on the west side, pulling herself up by roots, and a handhold she trusted more than she should have, and got eyes on the canopy above her. The sun was at her 10 o'clock. She had approximately 4.5 hours until dark, and approximately 3 kilometers remaining. She moved. The staging area was real. She smelled it before she saw it: generator exhaust, and the particular smell of a field kitchen that had been running for at least several days. She went to ground at 200 meters and spent 40 minutes not moving, which is much harder than it sounds, and requires a particular kind of patience that is not patience at all, but something closer to controlled suspension. She watched the tree line. She counted movement. She cataloged 3 vehicles, 2 of them light trucks, 1 of them something heavier, with a tarp over the bed. A structure that wasn't on the imagery, built since the last pass, which told her something. A second structure with a different kind of activity around it, which told her more. 12 personnel visible in her 40-minute observation window, with a rotation pattern at the structure's entry point that suggested at least 2 more inside on shift. What the imagery hadn't shown, and what she could now see clearly from her position on the elevated ground to the west, was the antenna array on the back of the heavy vehicle. It was military grade. It was not Colombian military. She took out her notebook, a small water-resistant thing she kept in her left chest pocket, and she wrote down everything she saw: make of the vehicles, description of the array, faces she could identify, the rotation pattern, the supply containers stacked along the south wall with markings she recognized from a previous theater. She wrote in the small, precise handwriting she had developed over a decade of doing this in conditions that did not allow for large handwriting. She was on her 3rd page when the patrol came out of the south. 2 men, moving along the western perimeter, which was the direction she was on. They were not walking like men who expected to find anything. There was a looseness to it, a rifle sling casualness. But they were going to walk directly through her position if she didn't move, and she couldn't move without making noise she couldn't afford. She did not move. They passed 11 feet to her left. She could hear them talking. She wrote down what they said, the parts she caught, because she spoke enough Spanish for the parts that mattered, and the parts that mattered were the parts about the shipment and the date it was leaving and the city it was going to. She wrote it down in the same small, precise handwriting. When they were gone, she released a breath she had apparently been holding for some time. What Doss didn't know at this point was what was happening 4 kilometers to the southwest. The team had consolidated at the secondary rally point. Ortega's wound was through and through, nothing critical, and Theus had it stabilized within minutes. They had 6 personnel. They were too short. Team Sergeant Whitaker had called in the situation report. He had noted 2 personnel unaccounted for. He had noted the ambush contact. He had requested a 30-minute delay on the extraction window to conduct a search of the ambush site. The request was denied by the man running the operation from the forward operating base, a major named Bryce, who had taken over the coordination role 6 weeks ago from an officer who actually knew this terrain. Bryce ran the kind of operation where the timeline was the priority and everything else was a variable. And his decision to deny the delay was the kind of decision that looks reasonable on a log and sounds very different spoken aloud. Assets are committed, he'd said over the command net. Execute you on timeline. Whitaker had said something back. There was a pause. And then the team had moved to the extraction point because Whitaker was a professional, and professionals sometimes have to execute orders that they are going to spend the rest of their careers not forgetting. By the time they were lifting off, Doss was 2 kilometers into her move toward the objective and had not yet smelled the generator. Bryce filed a report that evening. The report noted the ambush. The report noted the successful extraction of 6 personnel. The report noted 2 personnel as missing, status unknown, and moved on to the next paragraph. He filed that report while she was lying in the dark, in the jungle watching a fuel resupply that told her exactly how long that compound had been running and exactly how long it planned to keep running. She moved on the compound at 0340. The decision to move rather than simply observe was not taken lightly. She had the documentation, she had the notebook, but she had also been watching for 6 hours, and she had counted the personnel, and she had timed the rotations, and she had seen, at approximately 22:15, a shipment offloaded from the heavy vehicle that she recognized from the markings as something that had no business being moved through a jungle corridor, and every business being documented and stopped. There were things in that compound that needed to not leave that compound. She moved along the western perimeter in a route that the patrol pattern had told her was the longest gap between passes. She had 22 minutes. She used 14 of them reaching the south wall without making a sound, which was a function of the ankle not cooperating, and her finding a way to make it cooperate that she would not fully feel until 48 hours later. The south wall had a window. The window had a latch that was the kind of latch that assumes no one is coming. Inside was the communications structure. She spent 4 minutes in that room. She took the documentation she found there, and she also, carefully and thoroughly, ensured that the antenna array on the heavy vehicle outside would not be transmitting anything to anyone for the foreseeable future, in a way that would not be immediately obvious as deliberate. She was good at that kind of thing. She had been good at that kind of thing for a long time. She was back outside and moving southwest before the next patrol rotation. She reached the extraction point designation at 6011. It was empty, which she had expected, because the extraction had occurred approximately 9 hours earlier. She found a position with cover and concealment, and she set her radio to the emergency guard frequency, and she keyed it. Static, she keyed it again. More static, she tried the alternate. The same. She sat with that for a moment. Then she dug into her kit and found the emergency signaling device, a last resort item, a single-use transmitter that sent a pulse on a frequency that was monitored, but required the right people to be paying attention to the right thing at the right time. She activated it. Then she settled in and waited because there was nothing else to do, and she was good at waiting. At 0843, she heard rotors. The helicopter that found her was not the one she'd expected. It was a different bird from a different unit. The people who monitored the frequency she'd used, and the pilot who landed in the small clearing she'd marked with her smoke, was a chief warrant officer named Taft, who had been in the air for 2 hours already running a different tasking and had diverted because the pulse had been picked up and someone in the right place had been paying attention. Taft looked at her when she climbed in, the ankle, the mud, the state of things generally. "You good?" he said. "I need a notebook scanner and a CPR terminal," she said. He looked at her for another second. "All right," he said, and lifted off. She was back at the forward operating base at 10:47. The debrief began at 1100. By 1200, 3 people in that room had gone very quiet, because the notebook she'd handed over contained information that changed several things that people had believed to be true about the network operating through that corridor. Specifically who was running it, specifically from where, and specifically what the next shipment was going to be and when. Bryce was in that room. He said very little. The debrief was run by a lieutenant colonel named Marin, who asked his questions with the same controlled precision that good debriefers use, which means he asked them without showing what he already knew or what he was about to know. When Doss finished her account, he was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet. "You went in alone," he said. "It wasn't a question." "The objective was still valid," she said. Another pause with a broken ankle. "It was broken before I went in," she said. "It didn't change what was there." Marin looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something in his own notebook, a longer note than he usually wrote, and he moved on to the next question. What happened after was not a thing that happened in one moment. It happened in a series of moments over the following weeks, in documents and conversations that Doss was sometimes part of and sometimes not, and its shape only became clear later. The intelligence from the notebook was actionable. It was acted on. A shipment was interdicted. A network contact was identified in a location that had not previously been on anyone's list. An operation that had been in planning for 4 months was reoriented around information that had not existed before Doss had put it in her pocket at 0220 in a jungle room with a window that had the wrong kind of latch. Bryce's report, the one that described the extraction and noted 2 personnel missing, was reviewed. The review noted a discrepancy between the timeline of his denial decision and the timeline of the ambush contact. The review did not produce a formal finding. These things rarely do. But the review existed, and the people who conducted it had read the report and had also read the debrief transcript. And they had formed opinions that they carried out of that room. Whitaker put in paperwork. He put in the kind of paperwork that comes with a narrative, and the narrative he wrote was specific and detailed and did not use the word hero once, because Whitaker understood that specificity was more persuasive than adjectives. The recommendation moved up the chain. There was a meeting, eventually, in which the question of Doss's status came up in a larger conversation about the operation. Marin was in that meeting. Bryce was also in that meeting. At one point, Bryce said something about the situation and what it would mean for the team going forward and whether certain decisions during the contact could have been made differently. Marin looked at him. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been during the debrief. She went in on a broken ankle, Marin said. Alone, in the dark, completed the objective, brought back intelligence we couldn't have gotten any other way and got herself out. He paused. What decision are we second-guessing? Bryce didn't answer. The promotion board convened 6 weeks later. Doss's file went before it with an updated evaluation, a commendation that laid out the specifics in the same small, precise way she'd recorded them in the field, and a narrative from Marin that was 2 pages long and did not waste a word. The board deliberated for 4 hours. When the results came out, her name was on them. She found out on a Tuesday morning, in the kind of way that these things happen in the military, which is not in a ceremony or a dramatic moment, but from Whitaker, who came to where she was sitting in the operations center with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and set it down in front of her and said her name and her new rank in one sentence. She looked at the coffee, then at Whitaker. Okay, she said. He nodded. He started to walk away. Whitaker, she said. He stopped. The coffee is burnt, she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind that means something, and he went back to whatever he'd been doing. She was back in the field 9 weeks after the jungle. The ankle had healed faster than projected, because it did, and because she had approached rehabilitation with the same quality of attention she brought to everything else, which is to say completely and without fanfare. The thing that stayed with her wasn't the ankle or the compound or the hours in the dark waiting for rotors. It wasn't the board or the promotion or the coffee on a Tuesday. What stayed with her was the 11 seconds at the bottom of the creek bed, the count, the listening, the decision that had come at the end of it, which had not been a complicated decision the way that decisions made under fire rarely are. It hadn't been the decision to survive. She thought about that sometimes, the distinction between the two things. The way they look the same from the outside and are not the same at all from the inside. What it means to get up, not because the alternative is death, but because there is still something on the other side of the dark that needs doing, and you are the one who knows how to do it. And the jungle doesn't care about any of that, but you do. She thought about it in the way she thought about most things. Quietly, thoroughly, without making a production of it.